千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we delve deeply into the Daodejing by Lao Tzu. So the first thing that I'm doing in this slide is that I'm quoting from line 1, which is that the returning is the movements of the Tao. So the point that I want to make here is that when I say the Tao, I'm talking about every level of existence, not just the human level, not just the level of life that we live every day. We have to talk about everything in the typical Tao fashion in a specific sequence. What is the sequence that I'm talking about? Well, it's first of all, the world, which is heaven and earth. So we start with heaven, and then there's a level of earth. We were talking about life just now, so we must include the level of the myriad things, meaning the living creatures, living things. Then we also have to talk about human beings, because that's who we are. In the 4 levels that you see here, please keep the following in mind. First of all, each level follows and reflects the higher level. And I'm about to give you a lot of examples of how the reflection and the following occur. Another important thing is that because of the mutual reflection, the mirroring of the patterns among the different levels, we find that we can understand one level better just by observing a different level. We can understand how human beings interact with one another by observing how the heavenly patterns manifest, how seasonal patterns manifest, etc. So I'm going to give a lot of specific examples on how we understand the big, the macroscopic from the microscopic, and vice versa. So let's start with heaven. When the ancients observed heaven, the most obvious circle of all is the cycle of change from day to night and back to day again. That is the most obvious one. Immediately evident to the ancients, the transition from day to night and back again. If you were in ancient primitive times, you will probably note that even if you weren't informed of anything else, you would note right away about the change in day and night, today again. So definitely you can observe, and then you can see the position of the sun throughout the entire day. You can note the transition. Eventually, you get the cycle down to something that looks like sunrise, to the middle of the day, the midday sun, which is the high noon. And then, at some point, sunset. Then it gets dark and it continues on until midnight, which is the opposite of high noon. And then at some point after that, back to sunrise. So there's actually 4 phases, and then repeating back to the first one to reiterate for another cycle, right? This is basic. This is elementary. So I think everyone looking at this immediately you can see that, oh yeah, this is the most basic, most evident cycle of all. So the ancients observed continuously and uncovered more patterns. For example, after many weeks, the ancients could also perceive the circular phases of the moon. The circular phases of the moon, you now know that it would take months to observe the repeating pattern. Well, the ancients definitely had that time, and they certainly had the same thinking ability that you and I do, so they were able to pretty much quickly formulate their own conclusions. And you can also divide it up into different phases. The actual phases of the moon isn't just these, but let me talk about these and then we'll go to the actual phases. New moon, okay, that's when you can't see the moon at all. First quarter of the moon is showing, and then full moon, and then third quarter, and then back to new moon again. So here I have the 4 major phases as well. Now, like I said, when we actually study the phases of the moon, it's actually like 8 phases. It goes from new moon to waxing crescent to first quarter to waxing gibbous to full moon, waning gibbous, third quarter, waning crescent, and then back to new moon again. Rather than to talk about all that, I'll just represent it pictorially like this. The bottom line, though, the important thing is to note that you can see the cycle taking shape. You can see the repetition. Now, of course, to the ancients, when they saw the day and night transition, to them, it looked like the sun was going around the world instead of the world going around the sun. By extending the period of observation from days to months, the point in the second half of the slide is that you see a bigger circle, the big cyclical change that takes months to really spot. So there's more. Looking at the heaven, studying the nighttime sky, ancient astronomers saw that stars, constellations, all moved in circular fashion. Now, today, with more knowledge than the ancients, with scientific disciplines that we pretty much take for granted now, we know we have additional facts that we've been taught. We know, for instance, that the moon orbits the earth. We know that the earth orbits the sun. And we also know that the sun orbits the center of the Milky Way galaxy. So the more we learn about the universe, the more examples of circular movements we uncover. So it's kind of interesting to me that the ancients had no detailed knowledge of astronomy. They had what they could observe, which was often quite a bit. They didn't have an accurate model representing the universe, but they figured out the circular movements on their own. You know, without the advanced telescopes, without the current modern understanding, they were nevertheless able to figure out quite a bit. Now, I want to take everyone from the level of heaven to the level of earth. So we're still talking about circular movements. Now we're talking about how the earth moves in that same fashion, and it's following heaven and reflective of heavenly movements. So in Daodejing chapter 25, it says, 地法天, which means earth follows the laws of heaven. You can think of it as the patterns of movements on earth follows the pattern of movements in the heavens. Another way to say it, the circular movements of heavenly bodies are reflected at the earthbound level? Of course. Let's take a look at some examples. First of all, high and low tides caused by the moon. Well, yeah. So the ancients did not know about gravitational pull, but they could definitely correspond the phases of the moon, position of the moon in the sky, high and low tides. It didn't take long for them to come upon that realization, and it was imperative for fishermen and mariners in general to know, because they needed to apply their trade or plan a voyage. So it makes sense. Crucial knowledge for fishermen and mariners. Now, there's more. Think about the changing of seasons. Well, that's the change in the earth's, in the environments that we see around us. Every season brings about different changes, but it's actually reflective of two things that we know from science: that the earth is tilting at an angle and it's rotating in orbital plane around the sun, and therefore we're going to have the different seasons. This is crucial knowledge for farmers, of course. So we're seeing cycles everywhere in heaven and in the earth. So for the earth, the seasonal changes are, of course, spring, summer, autumn, winter, the 4 phases, and then back to spring again. Now, we've talked about heaven and earth. Next, we should talk about the myriad things. So what about the cycles related to that? Circular movements related to that? Well, in a similar way, the circular movements of Earth are reflected at the level of the myriad things. How does that work? Here's a couple of examples. We know that many animals go on migration, seasonal migration. The animal migration occurs on a seasonal basis, and that just means that the migration follows the patterns manifested at the level of the earth, which is the changing of seasons. Another circle that we note in all living things is, here we go, the circle of life. So there's that song again playing in everyone's head. And what it means is when something dies, it gives new life to another. It is the sacred interchange of life and death in nature. Now we see this at work in, for instance, how the corpse of animals provide nutrients to plants, which in turn feed herbivores. Herbivores themselves are prey for carnivores, predators, etc. So it goes on. The one thing that I want to point to in all of this, in the circle of life, is that everything, absolutely everything is used. Everything gets recycled. Nothing ever goes to waste. And that seems to be a characteristic of existence everywhere. Remember this, everything is recycled. Nothing ever goes to waste. It's a perfect system. So now we're ready to talk about human beings. And as you can see, these are heavy-duty topics that we get into just by virtue of talking about life and the great circle of the Tao. Let's talk about human beings. So first of all, we are among the myriad things. We're living creatures, we're life forms too. We partake in all the characteristics of the myriad things, plus much more, because we human beings have additional characteristics beyond that of plants or animals. So think about this for a moment. All of us, individual human beings, we are finite. We know we're here now, But we know that we're going to be going away at some point, perhaps decades from now. So we human beings are finite. But when we talk about family trees, when we talk about lineage, family lineage, well, families continue on. Family members cycling through life stages indefinitely. So you may not last indefinitely yourself. I won't last indefinitely myself. But in a family, we know that members of the family will go through the same life stages: birth, childhood, youth, maturity, old age, and death. Now, I hope you notice the difference here between what I'm depicting in blue versus what I depicted before in previous slides in blue. For all of those, I end with a reiteration of the first phase. In this case, I start from birth, end in death, because that is the popular conception. That is the fear for many, that death is the end of the journey, the end of the process. I just want to point out for everyone that this is not the case with everything else. With everything else, the cycle begins again. So I want to suggest, I want to present the idea that it would be the case for human beings as well. For now, though, I want to, before we leave the topic of human beings, I want to also make sure we talk about the interactions that we have to one another. So in this case, I call it the karmic circle as opposed to the circle of life. And this is about our interactions with one another because they take on circular characteristics as well. So let me talk about this for a moment. As we interact, we put out energy from us to someone else. That energy can be positive or negative. If we give someone kindness, if we show compassion, that's positive energy going out. Conversely, if we lash out at someone, if we blame, criticize, accuse, that's negative energy going out. If we inflict harm, whether physical or otherwise, that's negative energy going out. So as the energy goes out, time passes, and some people forget about that energy that's gone out. But at some point, the same energy comes back, except that it's amplified and magnified many times. We've all seen this happen. Sometimes the middle phase, time passes, takes, in our opinion, way too long. It takes too long for karma to show up again. Sometimes it is instantaneous, other times it can take years. Either way, just like it is with the pendulum, the cycles, the circular motions in the Tao is inevitable. So it's got to come back. It must be coming back. So there's more to say about how we are as human beings when it comes to circular movements. Let me ask everyone this question. What about the soul or spirituality? If you would rather not buy into the concept of a soul, then I'll just say consciousness. Human consciousness, what about that? How would circular movements of the Tao apply to human consciousness? So this is different and apart from birth and death of the physical human body. I think everyone sees where I'm going with this. So I want to return again to the topic of samsara, the wheel of samsara. And here you will see the Mandarin characters that I have provided here, 轮回. This is how it is expressed in Mandarin. This, of course, is the Buddhist concept on the cycle of reincarnation. And you know where I'm going with this: birth, life, death, rebirth. The wheel of samsara. So that is the Buddhist concept. And remember, the goal of Buddhist practice is to be free of this wheel. So what about the Tao? Well, here's the circle of the Tao. Applied to that, it is similar to samsara, but not the same. We come from the Tao, we must eventually return to it. The circle continues on, which means it doesn't end upon your return. Because the circle continues on, you are going to manifest again at some point. So the idea is that prior to you being born in this lifetime, you were potentiality waiting for manifestation. After this lifetime is over, you go back to the state of nothingness, potentiality waiting to be manifested in physical reality. At some point in time, the right time comes around, you manifest again. So in view of everything that we can observe, we've covered heaven, earth, the myriad things, all the different aspects of it, all the reflections, the mirroring, the following of the different levels. In view of all of that, the one thing that I can observe, one idea that I can suggest is that physical death cannot be the end. If it is the end of you as an individual consciousness, then this would fly in the face in contradiction of everything else that we can observe. So then someone had better come up with an explanation why it is the only thing that is different. There has to be a pretty good reason for that. So my own conclusion that I will offer for your consideration is that we are here together for one another. That's the reason why we're gathering every Sunday. We're here for one another. And we will always return for one another. I will return for you, you will return for me. We will engage in the circular movement lifetime after lifetime. We will be here to help one another, to look after one another, and we will succeed in our quest to understand the Tao together. It's time to summarize the different levels. What are the different levels? Heaven, earth, myriad things, and human beings. So in Mandarin, you'll see that to the left, 天地万物人. So far, so good? Now, as I illustrated with the previous slides, these levels all reflect on one another. They all follow one another. So the examples that I used, the seasonal changes, is basically the earth following the heavenly movements of celestial bodies. Myriad things, the animal migration is basically the animals, the migration path following the seasonal changes of the earth. And we human beings are among the myriad things. We're living things too. For each one of these levels, I have chosen a representational graphic. Let me share that with you. For the heaven, I have this graphic that shows the orbital planes in a diagram format. So the planets circling around the sun. Of course, in actuality, the distance in space is so great that you can't put a colorful picture like this together, but I think this diagram will illustrate the basic principle involved. For the level of the earth, I have chosen this painting depicting seasonal changes, as you can see there. And this is basically winter transitioning, giving way to spring, then to summer, and then to autumn, and then back to winter again. It's cycles. For the level of the myriad things, I've chosen this image of salmons fighting against currents to return to the spawning grounds. So I like it because it is illustrating the cycle of life, and it's also returning to spawn. Very Tao-oriented. And with human beings, I've chosen two. One representing the Buddhism teachings that we've been discussing today and also in previous weeks. This is an image of the 1,000 hands Bodhisattva, the Guanyin, goddess of compassion, with the 1,000 hands reaching out to people in need to extend the hand of compassion in assistance. That's traditional Buddhism. But I don't want to end there. I want to bring in the Tao perspective, which is not so much about reaching out in compassion, although that's certainly part of the Tao. But the underlying essence of the Tao is that we are one. Our hands join together. We are here for one another. It is no accident that we gather here today to talk about the Tao. So it's the other perspective. Instead of hands reaching out, hands coming in to join together. You and me, all of us together as one. So this is the graphic that I want to use to summarize everything that we have talked about in the 4 different levels. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.